In the early 1980s, Jefferson County, Illinois was the kind of place people described as safe. Sitting in the southern end of the state, the county was rural, quiet, and neighborly. It was a place where the nights stretched on peaceful and still, and crime rarely made the front page. But in the mid-80s, that changed. From 1985 to 1987, Jefferson County had 15 murders, which was an extremely high number for the area. 5 of those murders were by Thomas Odell, who killed his parents and 3 siblings. In November of 1987, the murder count for the county rose by 4. That autumn, darkness came to the small community of Ina, Illinois, and it came for the Dardeen family. What happened inside that small trailer is one of the most brutal and senseless acts of violence in American history. A family was wiped out in a single night. Decades later, no one has ever been convicted. This is the darker side, and tonight we begin where innocence met pure evil in the heartland of Illinois. Welcome to, or welcome back to, the Agatha May Detective Agency. I'm Agatha May, and I'm so glad you've joined me for the first episode in the Darker Side series. This series is a deviation from my others, and this one will be looking at the murders that are dark, disturbing, and diabolical. These stories are not for everyone, and this particular story does involve the death of children, so I'll understand if you need to sit this one out. But for the rest of you, here is the story of the Dardeen family. I came across this case when I was researching Illinois for my 12 Unsolved series, and I was absolutely stunned when I read about what happened. And stunned isn't even a strong enough word. I know that as I was reading it, I said words that I'm not going to repeat here, but I'll just tell you the story and you can see for yourself. The Dardeen family looked like the embodiment of small-town normal. Keith, 29, was a conscientious, hard-working man who had recently taken a job at the Wren Lake Conservancy District, a nearby water utility. His wife, Elaine, was 30 and worked as a part-time bookkeeper at Davenport Office Supply in Mount Vernon. She and Keith were both part of a music group at a small Baptist church up the road from their home. They had a son, Peter, who was just 3 years old, and Elaine was 7 months pregnant with a girl they were going to name Casey. She would perfectly round out their little family. The Dardeens were deeply connected to their community, but were still very cautious about strangers. Keith was known for his caution in particular. Friends and coworkers remembered how protective he was of Elaine and Peter, and he had a strict rule: nobody was allowed into the house unless he was home. And even then, they might not be allowed in. He turned down a man once selling frozen food who showed up to the trailer one evening and refused to let him come in the door. For over a year, Keith had been uneasy. With the crime in Jefferson County rising, he felt a heavier burden than usual. He told coworkers and family that he didn't feel comfortable raising a family there, and others in the community were feeling the same, that their once peaceful community had become anything but. So the Dardeens put their trailer up for sale and were planning on moving, but tragically, they would never get the chance to leave. On November 18, 1987, Keith failed to show up for his shift at work, and it was completely out of character for him to miss, and especially without calling anyone to let him know he wouldn't be there. So when he didn't call in and didn't answer his phone, his supervisor knew something was wrong. He called Keith's father, who then called the sheriff's department and agreed to meet them at the trailer house that the Dardeens lived in since he had a key. When the deputies went inside the Dardeen home, they found pure horror. Elaine had been bound and gagged with duct tape. She and 3-year-old Peter had been beaten to death with a baseball bat. During her attack, Elaine had gone into labor and delivered their baby girl. The murderer then killed the newborn with that same baseball bat. When the deputies found Elaine and her children, all 3 were tucked into the same bed. The baseball bat that was used had been a gift to Peter for his 3rd birthday. The brutality of the crime was staggering. The crime scene showed rage, sadism, and an absolute disregard for human life. But Keith was nowhere to be found. So deputies immediately suspected him of the murders and thought he was on the run. Newspaper headlines the next morning told of the manhunt for Keith. But later that day, the truth about Keith was discovered. Hunters found his body in a field about 1.5 miles from his home. He had been shot 3 times, and the murderer had cut off this man's penis. And I wasn't able to find a definitive answer, but it seems as though Keith was killed in the field. So how did he get there, and why was he there? Police were immediately overwhelmed by the investigation. Nothing of value was missing from the trailer. There were electronics, cash, and jewelry that would have been easy to grab, but they were all still in place. So it wasn't a robbery, it wasn't a burglary gone wrong. Whoever had done this had come with cruelty in mind. There were no signs of forced entry, which means the killer had either been let in or knew how to get in. And the brutality of the scene only deepened the mystery. Why beat Elaine and Peter to death? Why murder the baby? And why was Keith executed separately and was the only one that was shot? And then there's the genital mutilation. Was that something that was personal? Or did the murderer feel the need to emasculate Keith because he thought it would show that he was more of a man than Keith was? Theories piled up over the years. Every detail suggested that this wasn't random, and yet there was no clear motive or suspects. Some investigators thought it was personal. That kind of violence, they said, could only have come from someone with a deep vendetta. The county coroner made the statement that, quote, "I have been associated with the coroner's office for more than a dozen years, and this is the worst I've seen. Someone either had a strong dislike for this family, or we have a first-class nut on the loose," end quote. But no one in Keith or Elaine's life seemed capable of something like that, at least not that anyone knew. In the community, the theories were a little more out there. Some believed a satanic cult was behind the killing, but at the time, blaming a satanic cult wasn't unusual. But weeks turned into months and months into years, and there were no arrests. And as quickly as the end of 1987, the newspapers were no longer even reporting on the case. Then came Tommy Lynn Sells. Sells was a drifter and a serial killer, later known as the Coast to Coast Killer. He murdered at random, crossing state lines, leaving chaos wherever he went. And in 2000, Sells claimed responsibility for the Dardeen murders. He said he'd picked the family at random, that Keith had invited him in for dinner, and for reasons even Sells himself couldn't articulate, he slaughtered them all. But there's a problem or two. Tommy Lynn Sells was notorious for false confessions. He admitted to dozens of murders he couldn't have possibly committed. And if Keith was really as protective and cautious as people have said, would he really have invited a stranger in for dinner, especially one that looked like this? And if he killed Keith when Keith was still at home, how did he get him to the field? Investigators remain divided to this day. Sells was known to murder people with guns and blunt objects, so the MO fits. He often used whatever he could find at the scene as a murder weapon. And he once made his way into a home by telling the woman he was hungry. So she went back inside to get him food, and before she knew it, he was inside with her. So did he do that with Elaine Dardeen? Did he really kill them, or was he lying to inflate his reputation? Without DNA, without physical evidence tying him to the case, there's no definitive answer. And I think there would have been plenty of DNA left at the scene by the murderer, but DNA testing in 1987 was still in its infancy in the United States. The murders left Ina and all of southern Illinois in shock. For years, people locked their doors when they hadn't before. They were suspicious of strangers, afraid of answering a knock in the night. Parents held their children tighter, and families wondered if the monster who did this was still walking among them. Even now, nearly 4 decades later, the case is remembered as one of the most brutal unsolved crimes in American history. The Dardeen family didn't just become another tragic headline. They became a haunting reminder of how quickly the ordinary can turn extraordinary. and how evil can strike in the most unassuming of places. Was it a random act by a sadistic drifter, a targeted attack fueled by rage, or was it something darker, something we still don't fully understand? We may never know. But what we do know is this: the darkness that came for Keith, Elaine, Peter, and Casey was real. It walked into their home, and it left a void that can never be filled. Thank you for joining me on this first episode of Agatha May, The Darker Side. If you believe in justice for the Dardeens, please share their story, because monsters hide in the darkness, and sometimes the only way to fight them is to shine a light. Until next time, stay safe and be happy.